For some, the Wacom House in Vancouver is a historical gem. Built in 1913 for shipbuilding magnate George Wacom, it's a fine example of the arts and craft architecture movement, and quite possibly, and I quote, one of the most important residential commissions undertaken by the architect R. Mackay Fripp. Just look at its stucco exterior, flanking buttresses, bracketed eaves, flat open gables, and the centerpiece of it all, a large leaded glass window over the front stairwell. Breathtaking, right? Well, not if you ask the owners. In 2012, they filed an application to tear down this building because they wanted to build something else on it. And, well, that's where things got a bit messy. The local government moved to protect the building, the owners relented. The government then officially denied a demolition permit, which led the owners to sue the city. And that resulted in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of British Columbia. And at the end of the day, the Wacom House was saved. Well, of course it was. I'm standing right in front of it. But there's a bigger story here. One about the fate of older neighborhoods as a city develops. And I feel very conflicted about it. The struggle over the fate of the Wacom House is part of a much larger story unfolding across the country. As cities grow, old neighborhoods often face pressure to redevelop, and there's a big debate on how we should protect the history within these places. In the case of the Wacom House, it's part of a historic neighborhood called First Shaughnessy, a community that dates back to the early 1900s. It was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, who intended it to be an exclusive neighborhood of mansions for the city's elites. Today, it's filled with well-preserved homes that serve as some of the best examples of the architecture of that era. Styles like Craftsman, Tudor Revival, Queen Anne Revival, Colonial Revival, Neoclassical Revival, and of course, English arts and crafts. But First Shaughnessy is also in the heart of Vancouver, and its central location means that there is a ton of pressure to tear down these old homes and replace them with newer and denser buildings. So, what do? Well, in Shaughnessy's case, the local government ultimately protected this neighborhood by law. In 2015, it was designated a heritage conservation area, and with those new rules, homeowners were no longer allowed to demolish their buildings. The Craftsman, Tudor Revival, Queen Anne Revival, Colonial Revival. Shaughnessy's case is representative of a much larger trend. In the last couple decades, heritage conservation areas have popped up all over Canada, like Armstrong's Point in Winnipeg, Rosedale in Toronto, or Westmount in Edmonton, to name a few. These are areas that have been protected by law, where it is illegal to tear down buildings and replace them. That makes the heritage conservation area or district a very powerful tool for heritage protection. Instead of saving one building at a time from the wrecking ball, you can protect the entire neighborhood. But here's the problem with that. If we put aside the heritage factor for a minute, protecting a neighborhood in the middle of a city is kind of bizarre. In the case of First Shaughnessy, the neighborhood is a 30-minute walk from downtown Vancouver, a city with a housing crisis. Obviously, lots of people would live here if there was more housing available. But protecting the character of this neighborhood prevents that from happening, and you can see that in the population. There are parts of Shaughnessy that have a population density of about 4.5 people per acre, while just across the street are neighborhoods with almost 17 times that amount of people. In fact, the population of First Shaughnessy has actually been decreasing over the last few decades. This is completely unnatural, if not a bit unfair. But of course, you can't take the heritage factor out of a heritage neighborhood. That's the dilemma. I don't think anyone would disagree that there is value in protecting historic places, regardless of your cold-hearted logic. But this is where things get tricky, because if you really think about it, what makes a place worth protecting? Well, when you read up on the heritage laws and policies of major cities across Canada, you begin to notice some pretty common threads. Cities tend to preserve a building if it's an early or excellent example of a certain architectural style. It's built with special materials or methods that set it apart from other buildings. It's designed by an influential architect, or it's connected to an important person, organization, or event in the city's history. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty straightforward, but on the ground, it tends to produce a pretty biased outcome. We often end up preserving the buildings of wealthy homeowners, Those are the people who can afford famous architects, who might produce an excellent example of a certain architectural style, with special materials or methods that make it unique. And if they're wealthy, there's a good chance that they're an important person in the city. And that preserves something else: wealthy neighborhoods. Today, Shaughnessy is one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Vancouver, and it really acts that way. The residents here have a long track record of opposing new developments like townhouses and rental apartments, not necessarily to preserve its heritage, but to preserve its wealthy demographic. In the past, residents even opposed expanding the local hospital because they didn't want lowly hospital staff moving into their neighborhood. This attitude is enshrined in Shaughnessy's heritage laws. These rules don't just protect the architecture of buildings, they protect the large lot sizes, generous setbacks, and private gardens with rock walls, fences, iron gates, and perimeter plantings, also known as hedges. They even call for keeping out visitors by minimizing parking and discouraging vehicle traffic. From a heritage perspective, this is historically accurate. Shaughnessy was supposed to be a mansion district for Vancouver's elites. So by protecting the rich history of Shaughnessy, we are literally protecting the rich history of Shaughnessy. But I think it's worth taking a very critical look at heritage policies like this. First off, I think our approach to heritage protection has blind spots, and you can see that in the heritage we leave behind. Just a few kilometers away from Shaughnessy, there was once a neighborhood known as Hogan's Alley. It was an ethnically diverse community that many saw as a hub for Black Canadians in Vancouver. And this is Hogan's Alley today. It was demolished in the 60s to construct these overpasses, effectively erasing the history of this community. And I think we have similar examples happening today. There's a row of Filipino businesses next to the Joyce Sky train station that have been described as the heart of Vancouver's Filipino community. Right now, there's an application to demolish them to construct a 32-story condominium. A few kilometers away is the neighborhood of Little Saigon, where many Vietnamese refugees settled after the Vietnam War. You'll find some of the best banh mi in the city here, but today, there are no less than 12 new buildings under development in this area. I would argue that these places are an important part of a city's history, but they usually don't match our traditional architecture-focused criteria for heritage, and so we tend to lose them. But more than anything, I think it should be concerning when our heritage policies end up creating exclusive neighborhoods that actively try to prevent people from living in them or even visiting them. We need to be careful that heritage protections don't end up being used as a tool to exclude others, because, in my opinion, that defeats the whole purpose of heritage protection. Despite everything I've said in this video, I truly believe there is a real value in preserving heritage when it's accessible for people to experience and interact with for themselves. But what's the point in protecting our heritage if it ends up behind iron gates and hedges? Because at the end of the day, if we aren't protecting heritage for us, who are we really protecting it for? I want to end on a slightly more uplifting note and share some examples of heritage protection that I personally enjoy. Okay, for starters, I think Halifax, Nova Scotia does a pretty good job of blending old and new. Its downtown area has policies that focus on preserving heritage while encouraging economic growth. The result? New buildings that incorporate the original heritage buildings on the ground floor. Might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I think they look pretty cool. Another example I like is the west end of Vancouver. It used to be a mansion district, just like Shaughnessy, but after several different waves of development over several decades, it's now filled with a unique mix of architectural styles. For example, on just one block, you'll find an apartment built in the 70s across from housing built in the early 1900s, which is next to an apartment that was built just last year. I think the West End and neighborhoods like it remind us that there can be a nuanced approach to heritage protection. It doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing dilemma between protecting everything or saving nothing. It can be messier than that. And given how messy our heritage is, I think that's okay.